And now Jonah sees in that God's hand giving him grace, something he doesn't deserve. The death penalty for sin he could anticipate. But now he's seeing the grace of God, and he wants to praise Him. Welcome to the third episode of our podcast series on the prophet Jonah. We looked at some background in the first episode. In the second, we began to do some exegesis in the text in chapter 1. We just finished up looking at the end of that scenario there, where Jonah has been thrown overboard by these pagan sailors at the command of Jonah himself. As they had cast the lot, it fell on Jonah. He explained himself. He mentioned the cosmic deity, Yahweh, the creator of the sea and the dry land. And immediately there was a great fear among the sailors. They realized they were dealing with a powerful God. They asked Jonah, first of all, how could you do this to us? But secondly, what should we do so that the sea will calm down? Because it was getting worse and worse, and they were fearing for their lives. And Jonah says, throw me over, and the sea will become calm. They were hesitant, and we mentioned at the end of that second episode, perhaps we see some piety on the part of these sailors who are trying very hard not to offend this cosmic deity. They don't want to throw Jonah over. Perhaps in putting him in the sea and bringing about his death, they would experience even further consequences from the God. But there seems to be at least some piety there, some religious concern as well, particularly in that they pray to the Lord. And we've seen a little bit of mixing, particularly the personal name of God has been used throughout. But we'll see moving forward in the narrative that the name Elohim, the more general or universal term that was familiar to many of the peoples of the ancient Near East, will become prominent. But as they use that name, as they pray to the Lord, we see perhaps some piety on their part. They're concerned and they want for the Lord to be merciful to them. They're going to do what Jonah suggested. They're going to throw him overboard, but they don't want to be held accountable for innocent blood. And so they pray and they offer to the Lord both sacrifices and vows that they make as a result of the sea ceasing to rage against them. And we ended chapter 1 with verse 17, and the Lord appointing a great fish. And it's interesting here that in the Hebrew text, verse 17 in our English Bible is actually the first verse of chapter 2. And what it does in terms of its literary structure is it provides a frame on the heart of chapter 2, which is this prayer of praise, this song that Jonah composes. And so what we're doing here, and this is interesting, we mentioned how Jonah has a unique quality. It's not a collection of oracles of the prophet Jonah. It's in fact a story about the prophet, and it's primarily historical narrative. But we did not mention, in fact, chapter 2 is mostly poetic. And so we're shifting genre here as we move into chapter 2, the type of literature from a strictly narrative sense into a poetic sense. And so we'll notice some characteristics of Hebrew poetry will become quite important in understanding the message. But the first of these is a framing technique that's used throughout the Old Testament, used both in poetry and narrative, also in prophetic literature, and even in the legal materials we find what's called an inclusio, which is a frame that provides some context for the material. And typically the inclusio points to the center structurally of that material. And so by putting this frame on the poem, we're really highlighting the importance of this prayer, of this song that Jonah prayed. And so picking up with verse 17 in chapter 1, I want to read the entire psalm, the entire song, just to get a sense of its context. And you'll notice when we get to the end of the psalm in verse 10, there is a resumption of the narrative with this framing statement that kind of puts that interpretive setting on the poem itself. So beginning in chapter 1, verse 17. And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the stomach of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the stomach of the fish, and he said, I called out of my distress to the Lord, and he answered me. I cried for help from the depth of Sheol. You heard my voice. For you had cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the current engulfed me. All your breakers and billows passed over me. So I said, I have been expelled from your sight. Nevertheless, I will look again toward your holy temple. Water encompassed me to the point of death. The great deep engulfed me. Weeds were wrapped around my head. I descended to the roots of the mountains. The earth with its bars was around me forever. But you have brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. While I was fainting away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple. Those who regard vain idols forsake their faithfulness, but I will sacrifice to you with the voice of thanksgiving. That which I have vowed, I will pay. Salvation is from the Lord. Then the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah up onto the dry land. You'll notice that frame is very evident in God appointing the fish to swallow Jonah, and then God in verse 10 of chapter 2 commanding the fish to spit Jonah up onto the dry land. And so that provides us a unit of material here framed by the obedience of the fish. We mentioned this at the end of the second episode. Jonah the prophet has turned away from God's call. He has refused to deliver the message. He's even taken the step of hiring a ship to make a journey as far away as possible from God and from the point of God's mission for him. But the fish responds immediately to the great Creator. Just as we see, and I mentioned in the second episode, those plague narratives in Exodus, where God uses His power over creation to defeat Pharaoh and Egypt. And now He calls this fish, He appoints this fish, and this fish comes and does His bidding immediately. It reminds me of a statement Jesus made when confronted by the religious leaders in His day. They were praising Him and shouting to Him and glorifying Jesus. And the leader said, make them stop. Make your disciples stop saying this. Jesus responded and said, if they were to stop saying this, the rocks themselves would cry out. The Creator is going to be obeyed. His will be done. And so we find the fish representing that obedience to God in this frame. But in the center of the frame, we have the prayer of Jonah. And we learn a couple of interesting things about him. We mentioned, of course, in the second episode, as we dealt with the first part of chapter 1, that repeating phrase, what we call the descent of Jonah. He went down, he went down, he went down. And we've already noted in chapter 2 several of the images of the depths to which Jonah went down. But I want to mention just a couple of things about Hebrew poetry, since we are shifting once we move out of that narrative frame of chapter 1 verse 17 and chapter 2 verse 10. We are moving into Hebrew poetry proper, although there is at least an introductory statement there in chapter 2 verse 1 that sets up this poem, this song, as a prayer that Jonah prayed to God from the stomach of the fish. But as we move into the poetry proper, we enter into a slightly different type of structure in Hebrew poetry than we find in English poetry. If you were to think about English poetry, and certainly your familiarity with it, you would realize that in English poetry, the organizational structure is typically determined by ending rhyme patterns. So in other words, when you read a line in English poetry against a second line, you have words that end both lines that rhyme. And that's the way the structure of the poetry is set. English poetry also has a rhythm to the line. You can actually feel the meter of the line as you read the text. In Hebrew, we have meter, just as English poetry does, but we don't have ending rhyme patterns to structure the poem. What we have instead are what we call Hebrew parallelism. Parallelism is, in particular, in Hebrew poetry in the Bible, typical single verses are divided into two lines most of the time, and those two lines have a relationship with each other. There are three basic forms of parallelism. The most common is synonymous parallelism. That means that the two lines in the verse are saying the same thing. It's almost, in a sense, a repetition of the same idea. They're synonyms, just as words that are synonyms mean the same thing. A second type of parallelism is called antithetic or contrastive parallelism. And that's when we have the two lines in the verse and they actually make opposite statements from each other. This particular type of parallelism is found frequently in the book of Proverbs, in the collected Proverbs beginning in chapter 10. And then we have a third type of parallelism that's a little hard to classify. It's been called synthetic parallelism, which is sort of an artificial category. And it's sort of the building of the second line on the first in some way. In other words, the relationship's not nearly as clear as we have with synonymous and antithetic. And so with this synthetic parallelism, we have kind of a movement of the idea from the first to the second. And so as we begin to look at these lines in the verses, we'll immediately begin to notice the parallel relationship that characterizes Hebrew poetry. So for example, continuing in verse 2 of chapter 2, after the very brief statement, "And he said," which introduces the words of the song, notice the two lines. They're probably set off in your English translation here, and you could see both of those lines are set up in a parallel relationship. "I called out of my distress to the Lord, and he answered me." That's the first line of the parallel. Second line, "I cried for help from the depth of Sheol. You heard my voice." Now what we can do here is actually line up the components of these two lines and see the synonymous relationship. I called out in the first line. I cried for help in the second. Of my distress to the Lord in the first. From the depth of Sheol. And so what we find here is actually a little bit more definition of what his distress is. His distress is that he's in the grave. He's in this shadowy place called Sheol, the pit. And he's calling out to the Lord from this place. And then, of course, in the first line, he answered me, referring to the Lord. And in the second line, you heard my voice. Notice the shift of personal pronouns from the third person he to the second person you, which personalizes this call, this cry of distress to the Lord. And so as we go on through the material in this poem, we see much of this type of parallel relationship. I won't go through each line and point out the synonymous relationship, but as you go through it, you'll notice this type of thing happening quite frequently in chapter 2. And so what is the distress that Jonah has found? Well, he's been thrown into the sea. And he sees this as an element of his death. In fact, we might say here it's an expected element in the sense that because of his disobedience to God, he is now being judged. And if we go all the way back to Genesis, we'll find the very first commandment that's given in the garden setting, not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For the Lord says, in the day you eat of it, you will surely die. And so very quickly into the Old Testament, into the Hebrew Bible, we see a correlation between sin, rebellion, disobedience, and the penalty of death. And so Jonah here is seeing himself receiving the judgment of God. He has disobeyed God's call to take a message to Nineveh. He has fled from God. God now has put him in the belly of a fish, and certainly he is in great distress. He is in the pit. He is experiencing perhaps even the beginning of death. Verse 3, for you had cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the current engulfed me. All your breakers and billows passed over me. We see here the idea of the deep. It's mentioned all the way back in Genesis chapter 1. Again, more Genesis and creation connections. In verse 1 it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was formless and void in chapter 1 verse 2. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And there's a mention there of the deep, this primeval chaos of waters. And this is the image that Jonah reverts to in verse 3. You cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas. The current engulfed me. Your breakers and billows were passing over me. So I said, I've been expelled from your sight. In other words, he recognizes the implications. This is God's judgment for his disobedience, and God is not looking on him any longer. Now, what's interesting, though, is we know from the frame that the author has given us that God appointed this fish to come and to take him out of the deep, in a sense, to be a method of deliverance for him. And Jonah will recognize that at the end of the poem. But right now, he's thinking about the judgment. I've been expelled from your sight. There's some dispute in verse 4 in the second clause how to take this, whether we should take it as a positive, that he will in fact anticipate looking to the Lord again in his temple, or whether he is seeing himself cut off from ever seeing God's temple again. There's some question about how to read and translate the Hebrew there. Verse 5, water encompassed me to the point of death. Again, the image of death, the shadow of death that's over Jonah as a result of God's judgment on him. The great deep engulfed me. In some ways, this is almost humorous. Weeds were wrapped around my head. We can see Jonah there at the bottom of the sea, and he's just been floating downward, and he's even been, in some ways, put in the bonds of these weeds that are wrapped around him. Verse 6, I descended to the root of the mountains. He's gone all the way to the bottom. The earth with its bars was around me forever. And so this is a continuation of that theme we saw in chapter 1, the descent of Jonah. He went down to Joppa. He paid the fare and went down into the ship. He went down into the hold of the ship. Now he's gone down to Sheol. He's gone into the deep. He's gone down to the point of death. And at this point, he's even at the roots of the mountains, and the earth is around him. Now, here's where we can connect back with what Jesus said in light of our connection with that, the work of those religious leaders to try to get a sign from Jesus. And Jesus responded, I'm not going to give you a sign except for the sign of Jonah. Just as Jonah was in the belly of the fish, so shall the Son of Man be in the heart of the earth. And I argued in the earlier episode that this is actually a picture of resurrection. That just as Jesus was dead and buried, so too he came out of the grave, so too Jonah came out of the fish. And so what we can see here perhaps in this descent is that Jonah drowned. Now, I certainly can't prove that to you, and in some ways it's a bit speculative, but when we look at the confluence of the terms here, just again and again, these terms for Sheol, for the deep, for the chaos of these waters, the fact that he has gone all the way down to the bottom. And notice verse 6 concludes with this statement, but you have brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. And so it seems that Jonah recognizes at the very least that this fish has been the beginning of his deliverance. He was thrown overboard. He began to sink. He went down and he went down and he went down, and he's all the way on the bottom of the ocean. And now God has appointed a fish, and the fish comes and scoops him up. The beginning of deliverance. And now Jonah sees in that God's hand, giving him grace, something he doesn't deserve. The death penalty for sin he could anticipate. But now he's seeing the grace of God, and he wants to praise Him. Verse 7, while I was fainting away, while I was drowning, while I was losing consciousness, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple. And so Jonah indicates that maybe moments before the fish came to him, he could only call out to God in his final conscious moments, praying to God, praying toward God's temple, asking God from the seat and throne of His rule and reign over all creation to hear his plea, to hear his cry, and to respond to Him. And God is gracious, and He brings Jonah up. He sends this fish. He appoints him to be an instrument of salvation for Jonah. He picks him up. And so now, as Jonah recalls the prayer that he prayed, he also recalls the way he described himself. Verse 8, those who regard vain idols forsake their faithfulness. This is actually, in his mind, a reference to the pagans, that they actually worship idols. Jonah has not worshiped idols. He has been faithful to the worship of God, even at this moment where he's at the bottom of the sea and perhaps expecting death. Verse 9, but I will sacrifice to you with the voice of thanksgiving. That which I have vowed I will pay. Salvation is from the Lord. And so Jonah turns this psalm at the end to a positive. He says, Lord, I know that I've disobeyed your call to take the message to Nineveh, but I've been faithful to worship you. And I've been faithful to keep my vows. And I've been faithful to give thanks to you for your grace and goodness. I've been faithful to offer to you that which is due your name, and to keep the vows that I have made. And so we see here, in some ways, a plea of Jonah for God to recognize, despite his rebellion, despite the things that he's done in disobedience, that he is a faithful follower of the Lord. In fact, we could see this already indicated back in chapter 1 when they asked Jonah who he is. And he's very bold in his statement. I'm a Hebrew, and I serve the Lord God, the creator of the seas and the dry land, the God of heaven and earth. Again, connecting back to that idea that God is the one who made heaven and earth in the beginning. And so Jonah now is again commending himself to the Lord as he thanks the Lord for His grace, and as the grace of the Lord comes to free him, to rescue him, to save him from this great depth, from this death that he is dying. And again, we can see in this perhaps just a glimpse, just an echo, perhaps a foreshadowing of Jesus and His death and burial and resurrection. And Jonah, I'm not suggesting, would have understood that at all, but we know the Spirit of God is inspiring him in putting this hymn together, this psalm. And so as he inspires Jonah, perhaps we see God just giving a hint, just a glimpse, just a little picture of what is coming, particularly in the final statement that Jonah makes at the end of verse 9, salvation is from the Lord. One other thing to note about this poem, aside from the fact that it is Hebrew poetry and the synonymous parallelism there, we do have several echoes of other poems from the Psalter. Scholars have noticed some similar language, some similar themes. This has led the critical scholars I mentioned there in our introductory episode, who would deny the historicity of this text and would suggest it was a much later composition to the post-exilic period. They would say, well, here's evidence of the late composition of this book, because the poem in it is actually echoing other psalms that were already found in the Psalter of the Hebrew Bible. This is certainly something that we have to address, but I think what we can note here is that the Psalms themselves were composed over long periods of time. They used some similar imagery. They were a part of a context that was very similar, in that these songs, we believe, were composed for the worship of the Lord in His temple. Jonah is certainly in a time when we would suggest the temple is still standing, the temple that Solomon built. And he has referred to that temple a couple of times here in his song, in his praise and prayer to the Lord. And so I think it's very, at least warranted to suggest that these references to these other psalms may in fact not prove a post-exilic setting as much as a familiarity with what we might call the hymnody of the temple, the hymnody of the Hebrew Psalter. And so as we come to the end of chapter 2, we note the frame. And I just want to preview a thought here before we move on. We are going to be moving pretty quickly to a parallel structure for the entire book. We've got this frame in chapter 2 that sets up the poem, but we're actually going to notice there's a parallel structure. Chapters 1 and 3 and chapters 2 and 4 have interesting connections, which we're going to explore in the episodes to follow.